dear Philip. Welcome to the UI. You are one of the most original and thought-provoking political philosophers today. And so in this short interview, we'd like to concentrate on your work, especially in questions of justice, economic, social, and probably, if we have time, a bit of linguistic justice, but also on your work on democratic theory and on your proposals in terms of institutional reform. You are known as one of the big defenders of the basic income. You have also initiatives when it comes to reforming the European Parliament. And more recently and more locally, you defended a movement which is called Picnic in the Streets, which is a movement in Brussels, if I'm correct, that reclaims public space for the citizens of Brussels. So we'll come to that. But before coming to your concrete political theory, I would like to pry a little bit into your intellectual biography. And so the first question to start off would be, what set you on the road to philosophy? So what made you interested in philosophy, in political philosophy in the first place?
An existential crisis. That is, I think up to the age of 15, 16, I thought I was going to study law, and study law as a way of equipping myself to do politics in some sense. And then I had an existential crisis, and I said, yeah, politics fine, but what are the ultimate goals? And then in fact, my conversion to philosophy was Nietzsche. I started reading Nietzsche with great passion. I even hitchhiked all the way to Sils Maria, to Villa Paola, to the sort of mythical Nietzsche places. And that convinced me that I first had to clarify a number of things, and that the choice of philosophy was really impossible to neglect. I had to study philosophy, but I did hesitate. I remember sleepless nights after my third year hesitating. I had done several things at the same time as a first degree, and then I hesitated night after night between doing economics and doing philosophy. But then in the end I chose to be a philosopher, but a philosopher who in fact throughout this career interacted more with non-philosophers, with economists, with political scientists, lawyers, etc., than with philosophers. In fact, the department to which I was most strongly connected at the University of Uruguay was the economics department rather than the philosophy department.
So your academic pathway, your academic career is really impressive. You've been studying and working at some of the most prestigious institutions like Oxford, Harvard, Yale, the UI. And if I'm correct, when you went to Oxford, you went there and studied under Jerry Cohen, or worked with Jerry Cohen, and at Harvard with John Rawls. So one question is, what prompted your interest into their specific work, and if you could share some of your memories with either Cohen and Rawls?
Yes, well, what you said is not quite correct, because I went to Oxford to do my DPhil, but my first supervisor was Brian Barry, and Jerry Cohen was not in Oxford at the time. He was at UCL. But I did meet Jerry Cohen at that time at a seminar at which he presented the unpublished version of Karl Marx's Theory of History. It was a seminar organized by Charles Taylor, and that's when we discovered that, in particular, that we had an absolutely identical analysis of something that played a central role in his book, but also in my DPhil on evolutionary explanation in social science, which was our analysis of functional explanation. And beyond the political bond, this created some sort of intellectual bond. He was my external examiner, and then so Jerry Cohen became then one of my closest academic friends. I always remember shortly before he died, our last encounter, I had gone for dinner at his place. He took me to the bus stop at Cowley Road, and in fact he had tried to persuade me to apply for his succession for the Chichele chair, but I had explained that I couldn't do it because I felt the place where I needed to be was Brussels, and that's where I thought I was most useful. And then he cited these famous verses from Robert Frost, I think, that finish with "and miles to go with before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep." We both had tears in our eyes when I got onto the bus, and then he died very suddenly, not so long afterwards. With Rawls, it's a different story. So he in a way, I felt very close to him also for incidental reasons, that we both had 4 children in the same order: girl, boy, boy, girl. But beyond that, I in fact, when I went to Oxford after Louvain as a DPhil student, that is the paperback version of his book, of his theory of justice, had just come out, and I bought a copy, but I didn't read it until 6 years later, because in between I was doing more philosophy of social science. I did economics for quite a while, and then it's only when returning to Louvain that I started his book. Initially I had found it, when I first looked at it, a pretty boring book, and then gradually as I went through it, I thought, gosh, this man has thought of everything, and I found that he sort of expressed far better than I could have done, in a far more sophisticated way, far more learned way, a number of things which I thought myself. So even when you had objection, I sometimes find that Rawls is a bit like Pascal's God. Pascal says somewhere, un peu de pensée éloigne de Dieu, beaucoup y ramène. A bit of thinking takes you away from God, but a lot of it takes you back to him. And with Rawls, I felt it was a bit that. You had an objection to him, then you thought about it, and then you discovered that in a footnote on page 554 of a theory of justice, he had thought of it and had a good reply to it. So so he was not as close as Jerry Cohen was to me. I met him, I think, 4 times, once in Paris, once in Oxford, one at Harvard, and then final encounter in Lexington when he was already quite ill. And we had a correspondence, and then later the philosophy department asked me to go and teach at Harvard the course which he had given for so many years, Philosophy 171, which is his political philosophy lecture course, which the notes of which became his little book, Justice as Fairness. So it gives me also this sort of link, but as a political philosopher, I'm really in the line, belong to the family that he somehow created with his book Theory of Justice, and to which also even Jerry Cohen in his later years belonged, because Jerry Cohen became less, in terms of political philosophy, less a Marxist than a sort of left Rawlsian who criticized some aspects of Rawls' theory, while sort of accepting really central features of it.
Thank you. So after all this British and American intermezzo, you went back to Belgium, and I've been talking to my friends. We were sort of curious, how did it feel like to be an analytical political philosopher in the 80s and especially in the 90s on the continent? There's this sort of thing going on about the analytical continental divide in philosophy. So did you actually have an experience of that divide? Were there discussions about it? Did it actually feel like being an analytical philosopher in the midst of continental philosopher? How was it like to be yourself in the 90s?
Well, to start with, I crossed the channel after my master degrees in Louvain. I crossed the channel as an intellectual refugee, and in the sense that I was appalled by the sort of political philosophy that was done on the continent, where you didn't seem to have a sort of choice between, on the one hand, history of political philosophy, where he studied ancient authors and then tried to provide a sort of clever, well-informed exegesis of what they wrote and what they thought, on the one hand, and on the other hand, sort of very superficial, sometimes very obscure, sort of polemic often about current political affairs. And I felt, well, this is not the sort of political philosophy I would like to practice. And I had my Belgian supervisor, who is also the only boss I ever had, someone called Jean Ladrier, who was initially a mathematician and philosopher of science. He's the one who converted me to analytical philosophy, made me discover it. I'll always remember the first encounter I had with him, where I came to him after my first degree with the intention to do a thesis on Gaston Bachelard, because I wanted to do philosophy of science. I felt before doing political philosophy, I need to do philosophy of science and economics. I felt that these two things. And I had been told that really the great inspirer of all the French trendy people, Foucault, Althusser, and all that, was Gaston Bachelard. So I went to him with a project of thesis about Bachelard, and he told me, well, Bachelard is interesting, but it's not very rigorous, and why don't you rather read something that's like Karl Popper? And Popper asked me whether my German, I could read it better in German or in English. At the time my German was better than my English, but Popper had just come out with an expanded version of it, what in fact in English was called The Logic of Scientific Discovery. I read that and I thought, wow, finally people who write clearly. And so in that convinced me. Then I went to Oxford, which was a sort of had an immense impact on my life, not only because of it consolidated my conversion to analytical philosophy, but also because I happened to meet my wife there, which is another important dimension of what happens later in your life. But and so I went there, and then I went to California, and then indeed 6 years later I came back to Louvain, and initially, of course, it was a very little niche and sort of minority position, a bit looked at with some suspicion by most of my colleagues. In Louvain we had a strong school of phenomenology, going back to the Husserl archive we had in Louvain. Who were quite, including people in my generation, most of them were working in that direction. But then gradually it became, especially in political philosophy, and in philosophy of science, it became then more the mainstream. And so philosophy in my university, but more generally in continental universities, is really very different in this respect. There's a huge difference between the time when I left as an intellectual refugee and the time we are in now. So that it was a big transformation, and there is some dialogue, some mutual fertilization, but it's rather limited. And,
okay, I won't push on that chapter anymore. So I just want to come to your substantive social and political philosophy now, and in a way that takes us back to Rawls. Your original conception of justice, real freedom for all, with the idea of the basic income as a means to secure that real freedom for all, belongs in a way to the same family of conceptions of justice as the one that Rawls belongs to. But there are important overlaps between your conception of justice, but there are also important and quite significant disagreements that you have with Rawls when it comes to thinking about justice. And I know that you're working on a book that tries to apply your conception of justice at the level of the European Union. So I was wondering if you can tell us a bit more about where you part ways with Rawls, and how do you apply your conception of justice to the European Union in this new book that you're currently working on?
Yeah, well, so as I already suggested earlier, so my own conception of justice is just a member of the family that was sort of created by Rawls, family of liberal egalitarian conceptions of justice. So conception of justice that see institutions, that give some sort of central importance to institutions, and that see institutions as having to be justified and be justifiable to the members of the society concerned, considered as free and equal persons, which is one of Rawls's formulations. And that means that these are conceptions whose principles must try to express an equal respect for the diversity of the conceptions of the good life that are present in our pluralistic societies, and at the same time sort of express an equal concern for the interests of all the members of these societies. And Rawls theory does that, working Jerry Cohen in a way, in an incomplete way in some sense. But I'm trying to do that too. And what are the main differences then with Rawls? There is one major difference, perhaps the most important one, which is the question, which is about the question of the level, the scale at which these principles of justice should apply. Should they just be restricted to particular societies of a certain sort, societies called, which Rawls calls liberal societies, or should they apply globally? And my position is that there is no good reason today to restrict them to our separate societies, and that we must think about justice on a global scale. That's one difference. And the other difference is that it's more related to the sort of stylized picture of a society, of a particular society that Rawls has, and that I have. And Rawls's conception of distributive justice relies in a very central way on the notion of social position. He views society as a set of social positions, what he calls social positions, which are roughly occupational positions. That is, he gives a number of examples. You could have agricultural workers, engineers in the industrial sector, and so each of these positions is occupied by thousands of people in a big society. And his two principles of distributive justice are formulated in those terms. That is, people with equal talents must have the same access, the same possibility of access to all these social positions. And two, the arrangement, the basic structure of a society must be such that the people in the worst of these social positions, in terms of social and economic advantages linked to these positions, that the people, that this worst social position must be as good as it can sustainably be. That is, compared to all the other possible arrangements, well, the expectations of people in the worst social position in the just society must be better. That's his idea. And my own conception of justice, the starting point is, or the stylized picture is rather formulated in terms of what we receive from nature, from the past generations in various forms, technological advance, capital accumulation, the know-how incorporated in our institutions, and in fact all these gifts from the past account for most of our incomes today. And so our incomes today are due to some extent to our efforts, to the efforts of the current generation. But there is this huge difference in the real income in our societies compared to other societies in today's world. The GDP per capita in the Congo is something like 1 or 2% of GDP per capita in Western Europe, and also compared to the past. So all this needs to be distributed in a fair way, and this will lead then, and this difference in the stylized picture will lead to consequences, institutional consequences, practical, which in some cases will overlap, will coincide, but in other cases may be distinct. And that's why we also have, Rawls and I, disagreement on whether serfs should be fed, on whether there should be an unconditional basic income. Rawls doesn't exclude it, but under certain circumstances you would say, well, that's the best possible arrangement, but there is not such a direct justification for it as I propose on the basis of my own theory. So what sort of stylized picture of the world should we opt for? And my view is that trying to think about our societies as consisting of these stable social positions in which people are for their whole lives, and even when they are pensioners, they have then an income that's related to what they had during their life, and if they don't have an occupation because they are housewives, they share the social position of their husband. This is a picture that belongs to the past. Now we have a far more fluid society, both sociologically in terms of households being decomposed, recomposed, but also in economic terms, people working part-time because they're forced to work part-time or because they choose to work part-time to interrupt their career, all these things. And so that makes for a far messier picture that fits better my stylized view than his, and that leads to implications that may differ on certain points, including one point I discussed at length with him, which is the question of whether an unconditional basic income can be justified.
So one implication of that, even at the level of the European Union, would be a basic income, a European basic income. I want to push you a bit more on, so if you have to talk with an EU citizen or even with a EU bureaucrat, why should they care about this conception of justice when thinking about the institutional design of the European Union? Or in other terms, what would be one of the major institutional implications of applying this conception of justice at the level of the EU?
Yeah, well, of course there are many implications, not only about the redistribution of the nature of the welfare state. One thing is also, if you think about justice as global justice, well, there is of course a very strong presumption in favor of free movement at the level at which social justice applies. That would mean get rid of all the borders, insofar as borders prevent people from moving, from going, traveling, from settling in other places. That would be a presumption, and then you may say, if for pragmatic reasons you can't do it straight away at the level of the world as a whole, well then something like the Schengen Agreement, so free movement within the European Union, within most of the European Union, is an important step forward. But we have to be very careful with this, because if you have free movement, but within a certain area, but while the redistribution, which is of course also a very important component, both for Rawls and for me, of what is needed for the sake of justice, if redistribution through the education system, through the healthcare system, but also through unemployment benefits, through pensions, through some sort of guaranteed income, if all this happens at the level of units that are smaller than the area in which there is free movement, there's a constant pressure on the redistributive capacity of each of these entities, because the people who are highly taxed, the next contributors, will go try to shop for the best, the most advantageous tax authority, and so they may move out fictitiously or really in order to escape taxation to another area. And at the same time, the entities that are more generous will tend to become welfare magnets, as they are sometimes called, for the people who will be net beneficiaries of the system. So that freedom of movement contributes to the equalization of opportunities, but if redistribution is organized on a smaller scale, it also damages or reduces the capacity to pursue the equalization of opportunity through a redistributive system. So you need to balance these two things, and in the context of the European Union, that's why I believe that a significant part, not all of it, but a significant part of the redistribution must operate on the larger scale. I own specific proposals. I always find it important not only to have these abstract ideas, but then also to make specific proposals in order to get the discussion going, including having some technical objections, but also get the ethical objections out in this particular way. My own proposal is for what I call a Euro dividend, which would cover the Eurozone or possibly a broader area, of the whole of the European Union, of what will remain of the European Union after Brexit, and so at that level introduce an unconditional, modest basic income at the level of 200 euros on average for the whole area. I say on average because it could be modulated according to the cost of living, not according to GDP per capita. So it would have a redistributive impact in favor of the poorer countries, and funded by VAT at the European level. And so, and I find it important to have this sort of proposal and to think about what not only well, is it feasible, won't there be, is it possible to raise these taxes in a fair way, won't there be more tax fraud, VAT tax fraud in some countries than others, and all this raises issues, technical issues, but also issues of fairness that must be handled in a coherent, broader framework.
Okay. So we don't have a lot of time left, but I will insist on two other questions. One of them, you have a very interesting way of thinking about the relationship between this standard of justice that you just articulated and democracy, that is democratic institutions, like free elections, public deliberation. And so in one of your recent texts where you agree with Jon Elster that democracy plays what Elster and you call the civilizing force of hypocrisy. And so I'm quoting you. You write, electoral campaigns and parliamentary debates create a public space in which proposals are put forward and arguments exchanged, potentially seen and heard by all citizens. Discourses are thereby systematically driven into appealing to the general interest, or to fairness among all, or to the fate of the worst off. If all actors play their role sufficiently well, not only those in power, but also the opposition, the press, the civil society, academia, it is not just words, but also actions that will be civilized in this sense. Never mind the most intimate motives. What matters is the words uttered in public and their grip on public policies and institutional reforms. And so when I read that recently, I was wondering, well, how would you think about this civilizing force of democratic hypocrisy in the context of what is happening right now with the recent political campaigns, especially in the UK or in the US? I mean, obviously, all actors did not play their role sufficiently well, but do you still stick to this argument about the civilizing force?
We need to, but what I mean is the following. Of course, you listen to Trump's speeches in front of his supporters, or to Farage's speeches, and you think, where is the civilizing force gone? But then you listen to Trump after he's elected, sitting next to Obama. You listen to Obama himself saying, look, this is your turn, you won according to the rules of the game, so our team is going to help you, just as President Bush's team helped us. And then you have Trump saying, I'm going to be the president of all Americans, and not just for the people who were shouting against all the other, I'll be the president of all Americans. Well, you say, well, there is something there. And so, of course, and the degree to which this commitment to fairness and to general interest is asserted by people may differ. In some cases it's very thin, but it's still there. It's still there. And then the question is, what can be done by the other actors in order to starting from there, being the president for all Americans in a fair way, an equal way, and then and to make it do it, to what follows from that thinly asserted commitment to fairness in some sense. And then the other actors you mentioned must play an important role. Now, if we are in a post-factual democracy, that creates a problem. It means that the academics or the people, the researchers, are no longer taken seriously. Experts are being dismissed, as was the case in the case of some of the pro-leave camp in the Brexit case. Also, the press must play its role, but if the press degenerates because it can no longer be funded through advertising, the serious press degenerates in this way, and we are left with tweets and Facebook, this this means that the other elements in the mechanism, and beyond the sheer, the hypocritical speeches, what is needed then in order to get them, the people in power, to do what is required, all these mechanisms are also weakened. So I think, and and civilizing force of hypocrisy is not presented as a sort of a universal fact that is everywhere powerful in all democracies, but it's what we need to sort of put all our hopes on and try to reinforce in all sorts of ways. And so I think the deep connection between justice and democracy is that one. That is that if you have a system where all the people, as much as possible, all the people affected are given a vote, are given a voice, then there is this tendency, which is not universal, for the people who want to rule them to say, I'm the president for all of you, I'm minister and governor for all of you. And that's the sort of lever we have to use, the instrument we have to use for the sake of the pursuit of justice.
Great. Just a very short question and a very concrete one. I know that recently you've been involved in a movement called Picnic in the Streets that you initiated in a way in Belgium and in Brussels, which is broadly speaking a movement that helps pedestrians reclaim some of their public space that has been monopolized by cars. And so, I also know that thing got you into trouble a little bit with the authorities. And so I have a question about about the specifics and the rationale of that particular movement, and in relation to that movement, if you can tell us something about some of the concrete roles that a political philosopher can play inside the city.
Well, my role there was in a way very modest. I wrote an opinion piece, both in Dutch and French, as we need to do in Brussels, under the title, the grammatically incorrect title, intentionally, and in English, Picnic the Streets, Picnic the Streets. And so when I said at the end I explained why we needed to picnic in the middle of a big central lane that cuts the center of Brussels in two, that's an urban motorway. Said, propose we do that every Sunday throughout the summer, and I explained why this needed to be done, and I finished by saying, look, it's not for an old philosopher to organize all this. The Facebook generation can do that far better, but when it will be organized, I'll be there. I've been in prison only once in my life, but I'm willing to go back to a cell for such a good cause. And by the evening there were already 3 people who said they were going to do a Facebook event group. I didn't know what it is, but I didn't know what it was, but I said, go ahead, do it. And then there were 400 people say they were going, then 2,000 people, and then 3,000 people, and then the mayor first said, I sent the police, and then when he saw there were 3,000 people coming, then more, then he said, this is a very charming idea, completely in line with my politics. And then after the event, which was fantastic, the weather was nice, and it was sort of very, with all the people coming with their children, their barbecues, their blankets, and just blocking the traffic. And then for a few days later, the secretary of the mayor phoned my secretary, but I was in Oxford at the time. I was teaching in Oxford in the 3rd term, and then before the event, in fact, I had already been phoned in my college by the Brussels police to say, you're organizing an event without permission. What was it? I said, I'm not organizing. I write my piece and I'll be there. If you want to lock me up, but I'll be there. And then, but afterwards, then the mayor said, well, I'm going to make an offer so I'm going to free the thing during the summer so that you can have your picnics. I don't understand why you want to picnic in that place rather than, I said, well, this is not what you ask. I'm asking for a permanent thing. And then in the end, so there was a municipal election, and one after the other, the various parties. There was a prominent member of each of the parties that was present and in the picnic. So I used that to the full by mentioning them by name in another opinion piece. And then bit by bit, all the parties committed themselves, some more vaguely than others. And then in the end it took then another year, and then finally the new majority came out with a plan to pedestrianize, then first to have a test phase, and this is going on, and test phase happened, and so it's confirmed. It's free now, the work is being done. It's very controversial because as often happens, the local shopkeepers and many of the local residents also are campaigning, lobbying against it, and so it's not that it's easier for a philosopher to trigger this and then to go and sit and have the picnics than for politicians who have to implement it and who are then under strong pressure from lobbies, especially in this case, like always in the case of urban renovation radical of this sort. There are a number of people who think or know that it will go against their interests because they have a sort of shop that will not survive in this context. But the people who will benefit are very widely spread. You don't know, even the center will be better for shops, but with shopkeepers who are not yet identified. They may not be in the country. Some of them are not born, but for the people in power, they have to resist this local strong lobbying and go through. And then afterwards, they'll be praised for it, but they are going through a very difficult period. The mayor, for example, there were a number of posters on several restaurants and shops saying that the mayor was no longer welcome in that shop. He was kicked out of one of the restaurants. So I'm still welcome in all these places. I'm just the bloke who wrote the piece and who supported. I gave some money to help the organizers, etc. of the following picnics. But I've always found it important throughout my life to not only to be a penseur en chambre, just an armchair philosopher, but also do that and go and stick posters and be in the streets when there is something. So you need to balance because there are only 1,000 usable minutes every day. But I try to promote this sort of practice of political philosophy.
Great, Philippe Van Parijs, thank you very much.
Thank you to you.